Okay, so this lesson is on complex sentences, and it's our second lesson on clauses. So just a quick review. A clause is any group of words with its own subject and verb. So we've looked at independent clauses, which has a subject and a verb, and it can stand by itself as a complete sentence because it's a complete thought. However, we do have clauses that cannot, even though they have a subject and a verb. Those are subordinate clauses. A subordinate clause has a subject and a verb, but it doesn't express a complete thought. It can't stand by itself. It leaves you with a question. Okay, so for an example, after she finished her report, right? When we look at this sentence, we wonder what? After she finished her report, what? It has a subject, she, and a verb, finished, and it even has a direct object, report. But we don't know what we mean by after, okay? And then when the sun set. When the sun set, what? Again, we have a subject, sun, and we have a verb, set. But the word when creates a question for us. It's not a complete thought by itself. Subordinate clauses always must be combined with an independent clause, or they're a fragment. So when we have a subordinate clause with an independent clause, we have a complex sentence. So we've looked at compound sentences, which has two independent clauses, two simple sentences joined together. A complex sentence has two unequal clauses. So we have an independent clause, we have a clause that could stand on its own, we have one that really can't. It needs the other clause to make sense. Okay? In this case, the independent clause is referred to as the main clause. Okay, it's the main clause in the sentence because it's the one that can stand on its own. So here's an example. This is the street that he describes in the book. So in this sentence, we have subject this, verb is, street. This is the street. That could stand on its own. It is our main clause. That he describes in the book cannot stand on its own. If we just look at this blue part that he describes in the book, it leaves us a question, right? It needs, this is the street, in order for it to be a complete thought. It has a subject, he, it has a verb describes, it has a prepositional phrase in the book, but it's not a complete thought. It is the subordinate clause in the sentence, and it begins with the word that. Another example. She can speak Spanish well. Because she can speak Spanish well, we can understand her. Okay, so this is a perfectly fine sentence. I know often when we're going through elementary school, we're told don't ever start a sentence with the word because if we just left it after the word well, because she can speak Spanish well, period, that would be a fragment. That's not a complete sentence. It's not a complete thought on its own. But when we add our independent clause, our main clause with it, we can understand her, and now is. So it's perfectly okay to start with because in this situation as long as we have the main clause here. We could also do it the other way around. So we have the subject in the subordinate clause here, she, and the verb can speak, a direct object Spanish, but again, without the red, it doesn't make sense. The red, the main clause, we as the subject, can understand is our verb, and her is our direct object. This could stay on its own. We can understand her. It doesn't need the other part, but the blue needs the red. Okay? And that's why they're considered unequal. A couple more examples. When the sun set, the caravan stopped for the night. In this case, again, we have our subordinate clause first. We have the main clause, our independent clause second. And so we have the sun set being subject verb, but the word when creates a problem for us, so we need the red. The caravan stopped for the night, with caravans being the subject, stopped being the verb, for the night, prepositional phrase. This could stand on its own, the red could stand on its own, the blue could not. The blue needs the red. So the blue is the subordinate, the red is the main clause. Okay, one last example. The mother camel carried the load while the baby camel walked behind. So in this sentence, camel is the subject, carried is the verb, load is the direct object, and the red part can stand alone. It is our main clause. The blue cannot while the baby camel walked behind. Again, the while would create a question without the red part of the sentence, right? So this blue part is subordinate clause, with camel being the subject and walked being the verb. Behind here would be a adverb. That's where the baby camel walked. And this whole thing is subordinate clause. Okay? So you'll notice when the subordinate clause comes first, there's always a comma. When the subordinate clause comes second, there's not necessarily a comma. If we look at the previous slide here, again with the blue first, we have the comma, but this red does not, right? So the only time you really use a comma when the main clause comes first would be with the word which. Okay, so if you have the word which, you will often get a comma there. But otherwise, you don't use a comma. If I had because after, we would not use a comma there. No comma when the main clause is first in general. Okay, so our subordinate clauses, our dependent clauses, start with subordinate conjunctions. It's the subordinate conjunction that creates the question. It creates the fragment. It's what creates the need for the main clause. And it connects our subordinate clause to the main clause. These are some common subordinate conjunctions. Now, they can be other words too. If you look at this whole first row here, except for since and after, right? But that, which, who, whom, whose, where, and when, those can all be pronouns, right? So they can all be relative pronouns. They can be interrogative pronouns. And so there are also subordinate conjunctions when they're used to connect a clause with a subject verb to the main clause. Okay, so it just depends on how it's used. That is nice is a pronoun. I like the book that I got for my birthday. Now it's a subordinate conjunction connecting two clauses. And the same is true with many of these others. So if we look at the middle row, we look at the last row, they can be they can be prepositions, they can be adverbs. Okay, so it really depends on how it's being used. Whenever it's being used at the beginning of a clause with a subject and a verb that follows it, it's creating a dependent clause. It's creating a clause that needs. It's subordinate to another clause. It needs another clause, or it's a fragment. Okay, so this is how you can identify fragments in your writing.